A year like no other, from the pandemic to race relations to foreign relations, as told through the books we read. Welcome to a special year-end edition of Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. This week, special contributor Larry Summers of Harvard.
Whatever you think of his skill as a president, his skill as a memoirist is quite extraordinary.
Former UN Ambassador Samantha Power. Bloomberg editor-in-chief John Micklethwait.
Britain and America, two of the countries that have led the world, have done it incredibly badly.
Wes Moore of the Robin Hood Foundation.
One of the big factors that plays into it, unfortunately, is luck. It's getting a break that someone else might not get.
Richard Haass of the Council on Foreign Relations. And Dan Yergin of IHS Markit. We spent the year glued to our screens, whether it was a terminal or a laptop or a smartphone or just a plain old television set. And the headlines came in faster than we could absorb them, flipping back and forth among COVID-19 and a presidential election and gyrating markets and stark reminders of the difference in the lives we lead based on our race or ethnicity or economic status. But even as we struggle to keep up with the day-to-day, it is not too soon to start thinking about the larger themes, the longer arc of history through which we are living. And there is no better way to do that than to read some of the books that were published during this extraordinary historic year. And so we have this special installment of Wall Street Week at the end of the year as we turn to the beginning of a new year, looking at it through the eyes of the authors who made us think and reflect about the history we are living through. We begin, as we must, with the pandemic and what it showed us about how we deal with a crisis and whether our governments are up to it. Bloomberg editor-in-chief John Micklethwait joined with economist author Adrian Wooldridge to bring us the wake-up call, a penetrating look at which countries did well and which did not.
Britain and America, two of the countries that have led the world, have done it incredibly badly. If just monitor it by the number of deaths per million. Well over 800 deaths per million. By contrast, Germany down around 150, and especially those Asian countries, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, they're in very small numbers, sometimes as few as 5 deaths per million, sometimes 20, 30 deaths per million. And so there has been a real difference, as you put, between good government and bad government. Indeed, government has been the difference between living and dying in many places.
And what accounts for that? There are various theories. I mean, for example, that Asia, particularly Taiwan, Korea, and to some extent China have done well because it's more of a collectivist approach to society rather than individualistic.
I think we should come back to China in a second, but on the broad terms, I think that's too good an excuse for the West on several different levels. Firstly, if you look at any measure of other things to do with state efficiency, schools, whose schools are doing well, it's the same set of countries are doing well. Whose general health systems lead to long life expectancy? The same thing. Virtually every barometer of whether a government is working well or not has been moving in Asia's direction over the past 20, 30 years. And that's the reason why it's a wake-up call. Arguing about consensus, yes, there is an advantage there, but it's the kind of advantage which gives you a 10 or 20% advantage. It's not the sort of advantage which explains somebody being 20 or 30 times better. I mean, you, David, in our day jobs, when we look at a company and one company is sort of 20% better than another one, you think that other one's in trouble. In this case, countries were 20 times better. And that brings me on to a second thing. If you look at South Korea, look at Seoul, London, and New York. They're roughly the same size. Seoul's a little bit bigger. And yet New York has lost over 25,000 people. London, well over 6,000. Seoul's lost a few dozen. And this is the place that bought Parasite. It's the place with some of the world's largest nightclubs. It's the place that bought K-pop, which I know you listen to all the time. It's a vibrant chaotic democratic city with a lot of creativity, crowded subways, huge things. It's got exactly the same kind of dynamic as London or New York. It just happens to be a lot better run, and it's run because people have paid attention to government.
One of the things you do in your book is go through the growth of government, particularly since post-World War II in this country, the United States. But also you talk about the fact that maybe government sometimes is doing too much in some areas as it's doing too little in others. How do we determine what government should be doing and what it should be keeping its mitts off of?
That is the absolutely kind of key question in the center of this. What's clear is that those people at the moment who've looked at what's happened in COVID and think, well, the answer is we must spend more money. Well, the West has been doing that for decades now. You look at what happened in Asia. What's effectively happened, what happened with cars is that Japanese went off and built better, smaller, quicker cars, and they took over the car industry, and then the West fought back. Detroit, everywhere, we began to make small cars too. Singapore came up with a new way of doing government, of doing it smaller. We should accentuate that to Republicans who are listening to this. It's a much smaller government than America has, but it's a lot better. And what's happened is that the rest of Asia has been copying that model, including China, which we can come on to, and America and the West have not. So it's like one of those revolutions that people haven't spotted. And I think the key bit is you have to have government focusing on what it does best, on education, on health, but even then being quite careful about where you draw things, handing some responsibilities to citizens, but not mandating things. And America has gone into a mess. And yes, on the whole, I come from the small government side of the ledger, without a doubt. But on some things like health, I think they're having a national health service of a sort is not only morally right, you wouldn't end up with quite so many poor people dying in such terrible circumstances from COVID, but also much cheaper. America spends, this is the most frightening number, which the health care lobby of the kind of private insurance and all that lot, they desperately want to hide. America spends more money per head on public healthcare, let alone all the money we spend on private healthcare. So there's more money on public healthcare than Sweden does, kind of socialist Sweden. And it gets a lousy deal for it in terms of the coverage for people. So have a much simpler system and it would work better.
You've mentioned China a couple of times here. Let's talk about compare and contrast of China versus the United States or the rest of the West for that matter. There are some people who come out of the COVID-19 crisis and say, look, an autocratic state may be the way to go. And what China has developed there is something, a marriage of capitalism of a form with a very strong state-controlled economy. What do you say to that? Is that a better model as a practical matter?
Well, the answer is no. If you compare China against America, there's no question at all that China handled COVID a lot better. China claims a death rate per million of 3. Well, I'm not sure I entirely believe that, but multiply it by 10. Imagine they're hiding 90% of all their deaths, which I don't think any of us actually, to be honest, do think they're anywhere near that, but it might push them up to 30. That would still be 20, 25 times better than America. That does not mean that democracy is worse. You look at all the other countries that have done well. Look at all the South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, all those ones are democracies, but also New Zealand, Australia, and some of the European countries. They're all democracies. By contrast, most authoritarian regimes did pretty uselessly at this. You wouldn't have wanted to get COVID in Russia, in Iran, let alone North Korea. So I think there is a sort of false positive in terms of authoritarianness.
Do you come away from your book with hope in this sense? I lose hope when we've tried it and it hasn't worked. I'm not sure we've tried many of the things you suggested.
You look back through history and the time when Western countries have suddenly begun to realize the necessity of reforming government, of changing things, there's always been times of competition. If you look at the kind of welfare states most of us live under, where you get hospitals, pensions, all those things, most of those began to come in roughly 100 years ago from now, back in the sort of very early 20th century. Well, some of the people pushing forward this were from sort of liberal, bleeding heart sorts who cared enormously about what happened to the poor, and rightly so. But many of the other people who really pushed it were conservatives, like the young Winston Churchill. And the reason why they did that was nationalist reasons. They were terrified about what was happening in Germany. People in Britain, people in France, people in the United States even thought they needed to have a sort of better quality population to deal with this. And I think what's interesting now in America is you have a disaster. whereas we've all agreed America has done unbelievably worse than its principal, long-term rival, China. Well, the more that China keeps on getting ahead, the more it's going to force America to wake up and do things. And that is what we all want, because we all want liberal democracy in the end to push through and come to it. And that is sort of really the point of this book. It's called a wake-up call. It points out that we're losing at the moment, but we certainly have got the capacity to come back. And most of the answers aren't actually that difficult compared with the kind of contortions that people in the private sector and other places have put themselves through.
That was John Micklethwait, editor-in-chief at Bloomberg and author of The Wake-Up Call. Coming up, the United States decided to go its own way as the world faced the COVID crisis. We hear from the woman whose job it has been to lead global humanitarian efforts, Samantha Power, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations under President Obama.
There's a pooling function that stems from convening countries and really, drilling into the insights that can be gathered.
This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg. This is Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. Samantha Power wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning book on genocide and then went on to work in the Obama White House on international humanitarian efforts, ultimately becoming the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, where she spearheaded efforts to fight the Ebola crisis in Africa. She's written about her experiences in The Education of an Idealist. And we talked to her about the United States decision to withdraw from the World Health Organization.
It's an extremely ill-advised move, and it has far more to do with Trump's domestic politics, I think, and his dipping poll ratings in terms of his handling of the crisis than it does the WHO and any desire to strengthen the global health response. 3/4 of U.S. funding in terms of assessed and voluntary contributions goes to such tasks as fighting polio, measles, tuberculosis. And so what he's eating into is steady state funding, the funding that the United States has been giving for many years. The United States has made no major new announcements about how it's really going to respond to the pandemic and how it's going to use the WHO and other international agencies to avert a humanitarian catastrophe in the developing world, and a catastrophe that, of course, will blow back to the United States because of our links through trade, through global supply chains, through family ties, and so forth, to even remote parts of this earth. So it's, I think, more of an act of spite and diversion than anything. That said, WHO has not performed, I think, optimally. I mean, there was too much deference to China at the beginning. I think that also speaks to the absence of U.S. leadership within the organization. The fact that China has been able to leverage a very modest contribution to the WHO speaks, I think, to the U.S. retreat from organizations like that. But the WHO needs to go back and look when the time is right and when it's not trying now to prevent millions from dying, maybe even the risk of billions being infected. I mean, there's 3 billion people in the world, David, who can't wash their hands at home, who don't have clean running water to do so. And so with all of these people at risk, right now the WHO is working on trying to ensure that governments in the developing world who don't have the kinds of cushions that we have, and we've seen our challenges managing our response, but who don't have stimulus packages or $2 trillion bailouts coming, impoverished communities, vulnerable communities, refugees. The WHO is out there and trying to offer technical advice as to how those communities can withstand what is about to hit them. And this will just mean that the WHO is now instead scrambling to figure out how it fills the gap that Trump is leaving, but also how it mobilizes the new funds it needs to really ramp up those efforts.
Ambassador Power, you make a very important point. You talked about being able to wash your hands, basic hygiene. You wrote in the New York Times recently about this great disparity, not just in the ratio of doctors to populace, but also, as you say, a lot of people around the world can't even wash their hands. So as much as we struggle with this crisis here in the United States, how much worse is it going to be in a lot of the lower income countries?
It's going to be devastating, I think, on both axes that we're experiencing, right? First, in terms of the lethality and the contagiousness of the epidemic itself. Because of close overcrowding and the close quarters in which people in poor communities often live, the ability to practice the kind of social distancing that we are managing, if we're lucky, in some of our neighborhoods in the United States, I mean, that ability is not there. And so when one individual brings the virus home, it's likely not only to infect whole families, but potentially whole neighborhoods.
Does it also, though, cut a different way? What is the U.S. capacity to really lead right now? Because unlike Ebola, for example, where we had some cases come back here, but it didn't ravage the country, it didn't ravage the economy, do we have the capacity right now, the United States, to really perform a leadership role globally on this pandemic? At the same time, we're trying to protect ourselves back here.
I think that's exactly the right question. And the answer is yes, we do have that capacity. But I think, of course, the perception is that we don't. And so why do we? Well, the kinds of people who would be pooling their expertise, whether scientific or public health or lessons learned in terms of what earlier countries have done. You know, this epidemic, the one advantage of the way that it has spread is that it's staggered. And we have the ability to learn so much about, you know, what has worked and when is too soon to reopen certain sectors, and what can we learn about antibodies, and whether that allows a greater preparedness, again, to begin to flow people back to jobs, you know, that you know, are not existing right now because we're shutting everything down. So we can learn. So there's a pooling function that stems from convening countries and really, you know, drilling into the insights that can be gathered. That's already happening, I think, in scientific circles as it relates to the vaccine. It appears to be even without frontal U.S. leadership. Then there's the sort of look ahead in terms of our manufacturing cycles and those of others in developing countries. But you know, it's not only about who's providing the PPE, it's about who's organizing the distribution of the PPE. And we have, David, huge amounts of experience in USAID, our aid agency, in the State Department, you know, our diplomatic corps, and even there are parts of Health and Human Services and, of course, very significant parts of the CDC that are only internationally oriented. I mean, that's where the specialties lie of experts who work within these agencies. So it's not as if they right now, the individuals I'm talking about, again, who are only a small subset of the public servants active in thinking about corona generally, it's not as if they're currently working on trying to get PPE to New York hospitals. They are individuals who could very much be taking a leadership role at the United Nations.
That was Samantha Power, former UN ambassador and author of The Education of an Idealist. Coming up, Joe Biden was elected president this year, and as the Biden administration prepares to take office, we take a look at what its foreign policy may look like with Richard Haass, president of the Council on Foreign Relations.
I think the real difference will be a Biden administration will work much more with our allies, South Korea, Japan, Australia, Europeans, partners like India, to approach China.
This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg. This is Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. January 20 marks the beginning of a new administration in Washington, and President-elect Biden has made it clear that his #1 priority is going to be dealing with COVID-19. But then he will move on to other aspects of his ambitious agenda, including foreign policy, facing a very different world in foreign relations than has existed before, as laid out in The World, A Brief Introduction. That's a best-selling book by the Council on Foreign Relations President Richard Haass. But Richard says that even there, the first thing he will have to address will be COVID-19.
China's in the inbox, and it will be for presidents as far as the eye can see or the brain can imagine. It's one of the structural challenges, shall we say, conceivably an opportunity of the 21st century. And as a result, there's no urgency to get it right in the first couple of months. And the contrast there is with COVID. We may not think of a pandemic as a national security priority, but it's exactly that. And unless we get it under control here at home, we're simply not going to have the bandwidth to do much of anything else. Obviously, it'll hold back the economy. And so I think that becomes the priority. It also, though, has real foreign policy dimensions. There's the question of the U.S. getting back into the World Health Organization. I think that makes sense, even though it's flawed. It's the only way to gradually improve it. I think there's the question of participation in global efforts to produce and distribute and fund any vaccine or other therapeutics that may emerge. I also think there's one other foreign policy dimension, David. If we can get COVID gradually under control here, it sends a powerful message that the United States is back, that essentially we can continue to function, and that with our technology and despite our political divisions, we can still make good things happen in this country. And I think that sends an important message to the world.
Let's come back to that U.S.-China relationship because it doesn't look right now like President Xi's making it that much easier for President-elect Biden as they made that move in Hong Kong that caused the opposition to all resign en masse. What do you think is the Chinese position on President-elect Biden?
I don't think they have any great hopes in the sense that this is going to usher in a new age of U.S.-China comity. They understand. Indeed, there'll probably be more continuity than change. If one looks at the people around Vice President, President-elect Biden, a lot of them have said or written fairly tough things about China, particularly over human rights. If anything, they'll be tougher than the outgoing administration. You have widespread concerns across the political spectrum on trade-related issues, on technology. And some of the people around Mr. Biden have worked in places like the Pentagon and have very strong views about Taiwan or the South China Sea or what China's doing on its border with India. The one constant here, David, is Xi Jinping's China is a very different China. It's more repressive at home. State ownership is not only continuing but growing in the economy. It's more assertive and more capable in its foreign policy. And I think the Chinese are plowing ahead. This is the trajectory they are on.
So as a practical matter, Richard, what is the realistic possibility of having multilateral efforts to really cabin or redirect China at all? Because one of the things you write about in your piece is returning to multilateral efforts, to some of the international institutions that we have. Sure. Can that really redirect or even a little bit where China is headed?
Oh, absolutely. It's called, in a sense, that's what diplomacy is about. The United States has this great structural advantage or potential leverage called its allies and partners. The Europeans could play a big role on things like human rights pressure or technology. The Asian and Pacific allies could have all sorts of role to play on economics, on strategy. I think there's a real question, though, for the new administration, whether it's prepared to join into what was the Trans-Pacific Partnership and work with other countries in the region to force China to raise its standards, whether it's economic standards or climate-related standards, in order to have access to half the world's markets. So again, I think the real advantage we have is changing the means of our policy. I think there'll be considerable continuity in ends. I think the real difference will be a Biden administration will work much more with our allies, South Korea, Japan, Australia, the Europeans, partners like India, to approach China. And I think potentially that's what foreign policy is about. It's to shape the foreign policy choices of a country like China. And history suggests that's possible. What's not possible, which is a tack the Secretary of State has been on, is to try to transform China. They're not going to walk away from the Communist Party. They're not going to become liberal Democrats overnight. That is, to me, just a folly. But I do think there's a chance we can influence what China does.
Thanks to Richard Haass, president of the Council on Foreign Relations and author of the best-selling book, The World, A Brief Introduction. Coming up, America's long struggle with race came to the fore again in 2020 with the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And Wes Moore of the Robin Hood Foundation took us through the anatomy of a similar incident in Baltimore 5 years ago when Freddie Gray was killed.
And so it gets back to this larger point of, did Freddie Gray even have a chance?
This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg. This is Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. The United States was rocked this year by a series of police killings of unarmed black citizens, including that of George Floyd in Minneapolis and Breonna Taylor in Louisville. And this is just the latest in a long line of such incidents through American history, revealing the deep divisions in our society. Wes Moore, the head of the Robin Hood Foundation, has written about one of these. It was the killing of Freddie Gray in Baltimore back in 2015. And Wes lays out what happened, what led to it, and what the aftermath was from a variety of perspectives.
Well, I'm a Baltimore native, and in many ways, Baltimore City helped to raise me. And one of the things that really struck me about Freddie's story was, I unfortunately have been to many funerals before my life, but his funeral was the first funeral that I'd ever been to when the person who was laying in the casket I never knew in life. And that haunted me. Because Freddie Gray's funeral was a big deal in Baltimore. But then the thing that really helped to trigger wanting to write this book and tell this story was not just the horror of his death, but in many ways the horror of his life. And that's what I wanted to uncover.
And you say, I'll just read a bit from the prologue here. You say, we had come from similar places, you and Freddie Gray, but I had been so fortunate, so blessed. And you go on to talk about your mother and your grandparents and the breaks you got along the way. How does it happen that two people with similar sorts of situations can take such divergent paths?
Well, I think that one of the things I wanted to be able to look at is when you look at the life of Freddie Gray, for so much of us, particularly for individuals, all of us, who feel like we're coming out from the margins, right? Where this wasn't always destined, that we could end up being there. There are a lot of factors that play into it, but one of the big factors that plays into it, unfortunately, is luck. It's getting a break that someone else might not get, an opportunity that someone else might not get. And the idea that we would have or can have a society that is relying on luck as a prerequisite in order for people to be able to move from one position to another position is really hard. And you think about Freddie's life in particular. Freddie was born premature, underweight, addicted to heroin. His mother never made it to high school. She couldn't read or write. She has these twins, Freddie and his twin sister, Frederica. By the time they had gained enough weight to actually leave the hospital, they moved into a housing project in West Baltimore that had endemic levels of lead inside of the home. And so Freddie Gray is now underweight, addicted to heroin, lead poisoned. And by this time in his life, he's 2 years old. And so it gets back to this larger point of, did Freddie Gray even have a chance? Did he even have a shot? Or was that last interaction that he had where he died, was killed in police custody for the crime of making eye contact with police, which triggered probable cause? Was that the last system to break in the life of Freddie Gray?
Well, see, that's what one of the things I found very powerful in this book is, obviously what happened with the police was inexcusable. Police officers were indicted, although I don't think they were convicted. But it was inexcusable what happened to him in that police van. But the problem with Freddie Gray started way past that. And when you talk about systems, we talk about systemic racism, systemic inequality. It's a series of systems. There's a lot of systems here that put Freddie Gray in the wrong place. And for that matter, put police in the wrong place at the same time.
That's exactly right. I mean, when you look at the life of Freddie Gray, every system failed him.
This is a story about Freddie Gray, but it's also the story about 8 other individuals. It's a really interesting, compelling way to tell this story, sort of Rashomon, from different people's points of view at the time over those critical 5 days where really Baltimore was on fire. Give us a sense of some of those characters that you identify.
I tell you, David, it was one of the things that I absolutely loved about the story, because if Baltimore is one thing, it's full of characters. And I was hearing it from every single strata of our society about what people thought about what happened and what were the lessons learned. And so I really wanted to then take some of those conversations that I was having personally with people and share them with the world. And so I broke it down to these 8 characters, a police major who grew up in West Baltimore, who was having conversations with me where he said he's one of the highest ranking African Americans on the police force, but he was having a conversation with me and he would say, I know that none of my colleagues woke up that morning with homicide in their mind, but I also know for the kids in West Baltimore, why they don't believe me. A woman who lost her brother to police violence just 18 months earlier in Baltimore City, and who was loving the fact that Baltimore was rising up and Baltimore was marching and doing something about this, but also is feeling a real sense of frustration because she's basically saying to herself, but where was this when my brother was killed by police? And no one had anything to say. a basketball star turned protester, the son of the owner of the Baltimore Orioles, who's the head of baseball operations. So when the Baltimore Orioles played the Chicago White Sox, and for the first time in baseball history, they played a game and the official attendance was 0 because the city was in a state of emergency. He was one of the final people to make the call and say, I want to play the game even if there's no fans in there because I want the world to see this. And so by looking at it through these various sets of eyes, by looking at it through people who come up and represent different stratas of our society, we really wanted to show a kaleidoscope of how complex so many of these situations are, but also how it still fundamentally comes down to 2 disparate issues. It's race and it's poverty, and how those 2 beasts have a way of coinciding to create pretty disastrous results if we're not dealing with them.
That was Wes Moore, head of the Robin Hood Foundation and author of 5 Days, The Fiery Reckoning of an American City. Coming up, in a year full of ups and downs, energy was no exception. Expert Dan Yergin put it all in a broader context in his book, The New Map.
There are 280 million cars in the United States, and about 279 million of them run on gasoline, and I don't think people are going to throw away their cars. So I think this is a longer evolution.
This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg. This is Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. The pandemic hit worldwide demand for oil hard, leaving OPEC Plus scrambling throughout the year to figure out how to respond to that fall in demand. Dan Yergin of IHS Markit kept us abreast of all of those changes, but also put it in the larger context of how we are shifting the way we get our energy and use our energy, all of which is covered in his new book, The New Map.
I think it's an evolution that's going on. I think you mentioned electric power, and I was recently with a bunch of the leaders of the electric power industry. They do look to be net zero carbon by 2035 or 2040. Many of them are moving that direction. Other parts of it, I think it evolves over time. There are 280 million cars in the United States, and about 279 million of them run on gasoline, and I don't think people are going to throw away their cars. So I think this is a longer evolution. And I think there's what happens in the U.S., but the U.S., remember, is only 15% of CO2 emissions. China's twice that. India, other emerging markets are looking towards commercial energy to get away from burning wood and waste in people's houses with the health consequences. So I think this is something that unfolds time. Directionally where it's going, that's clear.
Directionally, the timing really matters, and the bets can be rather substantial. In your book, you point out how many jobs in the United States, I think there's 10 million, are tied to the energy industry. We also have trillions of dollars globally. Who's putting bets on which side of this? And we saw a report today that Exxon, basically internal documents leaked, suggest that Exxon is not moving as quickly as maybe some others away from fossil fuel emissions. China certainly might benefit, you point out in your book. Russia, maybe not. Who's betting on which side of this?
Well, let me say, I think the Exxon thing, of course, that's a still unfolding story. But I think what's happening is all major companies now are looking at their emissions and saying, what are they going to be? And then the question becomes, how do you mitigate them? And in the new map, there's this whole chapter called Breakthrough Technologies, based upon the work that Ernie Moniz, the former energy secretary, and I led for Bill Gates Foundation and Breakthrough Energy Coalition, about the technologies we need. And one of them that's really very major is what's called carbon capture, carbon mitigation, simply when you look at the numbers. And I think that's where we're going to see increased investment going in terms of research on that to meet it. In terms of countries, China's a significant winner here because unlike the U.S., it imports 75% of its oil, and it regards that as a major strategic problem, particularly in the geopolitical issues that are now developing. And it has a dominant position in many of what they call the new energies. For instance, about 70% of the solar panels in the world are made in China, another 10% by Chinese companies. And it's Chinese manufacturing that's partly responsible for this revolution in solar costs, which have come way down. So, they would be a big beneficiary of this.
One of the things that I was surprised and I learned from your book is the Department of Energy under President Trump is investing an awful lot of money in research, science and research, some of which actually has to go to renewables.
Right. $6.5 billion in basic science research, and that's the foundation, really the true foundation of an energy transition. And that's been pretty consistent. That has been one area of bipartisan cooperation in seeing the importance of maintaining that commitment. And this is where the US strength really comes from, which is we have this incredible ecosystem that goes from 17 national labs, that kind of expenditure, universities, companies, startups. No other country has that advantage in new technologies. Take wind and solar. Those are 50-year-old industries, but it's only in the last 10 years that they've really become so competitive. So it takes time. And so the investment you make now really pays off, but it can take 10 or 20 years from now.
Dan, draw one other contrast that, again, I got from your book, The New Map, and that is between Russia, which is very dependent on fossil fuels, goodness knows, and Saudi Arabia, which is also very dependent, but they have that Vision 2030 campaign going on. Does Russia have anything similar to that about what comes after fossil fuels?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the other day, Vladimir Putin said it's great. Our budget is only now 30% oil instead of being 40% oil, the money coming from it. But I think Russia's been talking about diversification for 20 years since Putin came to power, and it's really not happening. In fact, I was at a conference where I asked Putin that question. He and Chancellor Merkel were on the platform about diversification, but we got sidetracked because I mentioned shale, and he really doesn't like U.S. shale. So he gave me his opinions on that, which were pretty strong. So I think Saudi Arabia is trying to do it, but it's hard to shift an economy that is so dependent upon oil. It was hard before COVID. It's more difficult right now. And I think one of the things the Saudis, it's clear to them, in order to diversify away from oil, you actually need some oil revenues.
That was Dan Yergin, Vice Chairman of IHS Markit and author of The New Map. Coming up, we end this special edition of Wall Street Week with Larry Summers and his book picks for the year. This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg.
This is Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin, and we are back with our special contributor, Larry Summers of Harvard, for his view on some books this year that really stood out for him. So, Larry, what books really made an impression on you this year?
There are three that I'm going to comment on, David. The first is my former boss, Barack Obama's memoir. Politicians' memoirs are usually ghost-written exercises in self-justification and in rewarding the politician's friends with compliments. President Obama's book is obviously self-written. It is much more candid than most such memoirs. Like all of us, President Obama sees himself in a basically favorable light, but with much more admission of uncertainty, of possible regret, and much more candor in his portraits of events and ideas. And so if one's looking for a government memoir or a political memoir that gives a feeling of what it's like to be there, seeing things as a senior actor does, I can't think of one that's better than President Obama's. Whatever you think of his skill as a president, his skill as a memoirist is quite extraordinary.
And one of the things that struck me about that book, Larry, was that it doesn't feel like it's pulling a lot of punches, but it also doesn't feel like it's a lot of score settling. And there are people clearly he has really differences of opinion with, people actually he really doesn't quite admire, and yet it doesn't feel like he's settling scores.
I think that President Obama's strength, and some would say his limitation, is a kind of extraordinarily mature perspective and capacity for strategic empathy. He has the ability to walk in the shoes of others. And and therefore to understand where they're coming from. And that limits his capacity for rage or for a desire for revenge. And for many of us, that is a great strength. For others, it bespeaks an excessive neutrality when merits are clear. But I think that is something that comes through in a book that is certainly quite revealing of the character of its author.
So that's one, President Obama's book, Deaths of Despair.
Deaths of Despair is written by the Princeton professors Ann Case and Angus Deaton, and particularly for those like me who are drawn to statistics and quantitative information, it is a profoundly disturbing evocation of what is happening to the middle of our country. What's happening to the middle of our country geographically, what's happening to the middle of our country in the sense of the middle of the income distribution, what's happening to people who have middle-rung jobs in hierarchies. And what's happening is that too many of them are dying too young. We've taken it as a hallmark of a progressive society that life expectancy goes up. And for substantial subgroups in our population, that has stopped being true. And that is disturbing in its own sake. And it is also disturbing because of all of the things in terms of life fulfillment that are likely to be coinciding with that. And so in terms of pointing to what is going to be a huge challenge for our democracy going forward, this book does a superb job of complementing more individualistic treatments like Hillbilly Elegy of life. And you can agree or disagree with some of their policy recommendations, but there's a starkness in decreasing life expectancy and increasing death that I think has to command the attention of anyone who cares about our country's future.
And your third selection goes overseas to China.
Kishore Mahbubani, a longtime Singaporean diplomat and international thinker, has been perhaps the most powerful voice over the last decade, making the case that the big transformation in the world is the shift in the center of gravity of just about everything from the West to the East. And he makes this case in many ways and in different forums, notably in this book, Has China Won? But I have to say that when I looked at non-democratic China running its society in a way where, despite early mistakes, the death rate from COVID as a share of the population was in the range of being just 1 or 2% of what ours has been. It does have to make you think about the capacity of different systems to protect their people. And I think that people have to look very carefully at the differences between Asia and the West in terms of the success with which societies have dealt with COVID, and think very carefully about that. I'm not prepared to say what it means or what policy inferences follow from it, but it is a very stark kind of observation, and one that I think will deserve over time a lot of reflection.
It's a very powerful point, although it also breaks down in some messy ways as well. John Micklethwait, our friend, our mutual friend, wrote a book as well this year, and he noted that, in fact, it did not break down necessarily by authoritarian versus democratic. I mean, even in Asia, you have Taiwan, you have South Korea, you have New Zealand, for goodness sakes.
It doesn't break down on authoritarian democracy grounds, and as the examples of New Zealand and Australia suggest, it doesn't break down on racial or ethnic grounds. And I don't think it's something that we fully understand, but it's something that I think is very important. And I think it will lead to more of the kind of thinking that Kishore Mahbubani engages in this book. And as I say, I'm not prepared to reach any conclusion, but I think often in life, what's really important is to ask the right questions. And I think in a way, all three of these books, Kishore on China's success, Case and Deaton on the patterns of mortality, Obama on reflecting on our political system from the perspective of someone leading it, pose profoundly important questions. And that's the first step towards making progress.
It certainly sounds right. It certainly is what we get out of books. It's really invaluable. Thank you so much to our special Wall Street Week contributor, Larry Summers of Harvard.
Finally, one more thought. It was truly a year for the history books, with some of that history already written and much more yet to come. But as we start to look forward, take a look at what we read this past year. According to both Amazon and the New York Public Library, it was not the books about the pandemic or about the economy or about the presidential election. No, it was the books about race that captured our attention this past year. Books like The Vanishing Half and White Fragility and Where the Crawdads Sing, not to mention not one but two books by the Obamas. Speaking personally, the book I read this year that made the most difference to me was The Warmth of Other Suns, the story of the mass migration in the 20th century of Black Americans from the South to the North, what they endured, and how their experiences have profound and lasting effects to this day. We have a lot to put behind us, a lot to repair in our healthcare system.
There's going to be a lot of lessons learned in all of this. One of them is to rebuild our local public health systems.
To our economy.
Until we're really behind this, everybody's going to be suffering to some extent.
To the way we govern ourselves. But if there is one thing that 2020 should have taught us, it is that we cannot truly move forward until we understand our past, until we understand the extent to which we have fallen short of our shared goal to make sure that all of us have the means to pursue our hopes and our dreams, that all of us can fully exercise our rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That does it for this episode of Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. This is Bloomberg. See you next week.